There are nights when a story feels so familiar that we stop hearing it. We remember the ark. We remember the flood. We remember the dove, the mountain, the dry ground, the covenant in the sky. And after that, most minds move quickly to the same three names: Shem, Ham, Japheth, 3 sons, 3 survivors, 3 men standing beside their father on the far side of a ruined world. But tonight, weary soul, we are going to stay with them longer than most readers do. Because hidden inside one of the old texts preserved in the Ethiopian biblical tradition, there is a line almost no one reads aloud anymore. A line spoken after the flood. A line given from a father to his sons. A line about what the waters did not erase. And that line changes the feeling of the whole story. Tonight, we are going to follow the path of 3 sons and 1 omitted line, and what the Ethiopian Bible preserved about giants. We are going to walk carefully into the memory Noah handed down after the ark came to rest. We are going to listen for the warning buried beneath the survival. And before this night is over, you will hear why the old world did not disappear as completely as many people imagine. A flood can end a generation. It does not always end its memory. That is where we begin. I am Pastor Michael, and tonight I want to place something in your hands with care. Not a spectacle, not a sensational claim, a detail, a textual detail, a paternal warning, a preserved thread. There are verses that survive quietly for centuries, and when I come across one like that, I feel a duty to hand it onward without rushing it. This is one of those nights, because the part of Noah's story many people carry is the part that looks clean. Judgment falls. The wicked world passes. The righteous family remains. History starts over. But old sacred literature is often less tidy than the summaries we inherit. And in the Ethiopian manuscript world, especially in the Book of Jubilees, the air after the flood still carries memory from before it. Noah does not speak like a man who thinks evil has vanished forever. He speaks like a man who has seen what violence can become. He speaks like a father who knows that survival alone does not guarantee purity. He speaks like someone trying to keep his sons from repeating an older corruption. And that is why the title matters. Not only 3 sons, not only 1 omitted line, but a preserved warning about giants, about the kind of world that existed before the rain, about the kind of bloodshed that filled the earth, about the kind of appetite that holy texts remember with horror. The old witness we will lean on tonight is tied especially to the Book of Jubilees, known in Gu'e's tradition as Mesrafe Kufale, the Book of Divisions. And in its 7th chapter, after Noah's vineyard, after his shame, after the blessing and separation of his sons, there comes a fatherly instruction, a solemn instruction. And inside that instruction appears a chain of memory most modern listeners were never taught to expect. That chain moves backward, from sons, to father, to flood, to blood, to the violence before the flood, to the strange beings whose story ancient Jewish and Ethiopian tradition refused to flatten into a footnote. If you have ever felt that Genesis gives you the bones of something larger, you are not imagining that feeling. If you have ever sensed that a story of Noah ends too neatly in the versions most people hear, you are not wrong to feel that. And if you have ever wondered whether the world after judgment still carries scars from the world before it, tonight's old line will meet you there. What moves me here is not only that the line survived, it is that the line survived in the mouth of a father. Noah does not hand his sons a map. He hands them a moral memory. He does not merely tell them they were saved. He tells them what kind of corruption once filled the earth, and what kind of behavior could invite that darkness again. So, before we go any farther, hold the image plainly. Not a crowd, not a nation, not a council chamber. A father, 3 sons, dry ground after a catastrophe, and words spoken into the fragile beginning of a new human age. Words meant to prevent an old ruin from returning. In a little while, we will hear how that warning opens. We will hear why the line belongs beside giants, why blood becomes central, and why the Ethiopian preservation of this moment matters more than many people realize. But first, we need to stand inside the version of the story most people already think they know, because only then can we feel what has gone missing. The familiar memory of Noah's 3 sons is established, and the hidden gap inside that familiar story begins to show. Most people know the 3 sons of Noah the way people know the names of old landmarks, not because they visit them often, but because they have heard them so many times that the names seem settled. Shem, Ham, Japheth. The names arrive with a feeling of completion, as though once the 3 names are spoken, the shape of the story is finished, as though all that remains is a genealogy, a scattering of nations, and a world beginning again under a cleaner sky. That is the common memory. And, to be fair, it is not invented. Genesis really does give us those sons. Genesis really does place them at the hinge of old world and new. Genesis really does let all later peoples seem to branch outward from that narrow family line. But there is a difference between a true outline and a complete hearing. A great many listeners receive Noah's story in summary form. The world became violent. God judged it. Noah obeyed. The ark floated. The waters fell back. The family emerged. Then humanity started over. And because that outline is so strong, the mind often hurries past the atmosphere after the flood. It hurries past what a man like Noah would have remembered. It hurries past what a father would fear. It hurries past the possibility that the greatest anxiety after survival is not relief, but repetition. Imagine it carefully. The ground is real beneath your feet again. The animals have gone out. The waterline has receded from the slopes. The sky is no longer a sentence. And yet the man standing there is not innocent in the way a child is innocent. He has seen the end of a civilization. He has watched divine judgment tear through a world swollen with violence. He knows what human corruption can become when it grows unchecked. So when Noah turns toward his sons in the old literature, why should we assume he has nothing urgent to say beyond blessing? Why should we assume survival itself is the end of the lesson? Why should we imagine the flood cleaned memory so thoroughly that warning was no longer needed? This is where the story begins to open. Because in the older interpretive traditions around Noah, those 3 sons are not only heirs of a covenant, they are heirs of knowledge, heirs of warning, heirs of a memory severe enough to shape conduct in the generations after them. And this is not a small distinction. It changes the emotional weather of the scene. If Noah steps out of the ark as merely the preserved hero, the story becomes distant. But if Noah steps out of the ark as the surviving witness to a world that destroyed itself under corruption, then every instruction he gives his sons begins to carry another tone, a trembling tone, a guarded tone, not panic, not despair, but the solemnity of a man who knows that evil is not defeated simply because it has been judged once. That is why the title narrows our attention to 3 sons, not because their names are hidden. Their names are famous, but because what was said to them is not famous. And in the Ethiopian preserved witness of Jubilees, that forgotten fatherly instruction becomes one of the most important post-flood passages in the entire tradition. The word used there for the book is kufale. In Ge'ez tradition, that means divisions, ordered portions, measured arrangements of sacred history. And I think there is something fitting in that, because what Jubilees often does is return to stories people think they already know and divide them more finely. It slows the narrative down. It opens chambers inside familiar events. It makes you realize that what looked simple from far away becomes textured when approached gently. I find that deeply moving, not because complexity is automatically holy, but because haste so often robs old stories of their moral weight, and Noah's sons have been hurried past for a very long time. Shem becomes the line people use for blessing. Ham becomes the line people have too often misused and mishandled in later history. Japheth becomes a branch in the table of nations. And the deeper human moment between father and sons is left thinner than it should be. Yet the old text does not leave it thin. It lingers. It lets Noah teach. It lets Noah warn. It lets the post-flood world feel fragile. That fragility matters tonight, because it means the reset was never a blank page. It was a page written over scars. It was a beginning burdened by memory. It was the birth of a future inside a family that already knew what the worst form of human rebellion could do. And somewhere inside that burdened beginning, there stands one line most listeners have never been invited to hear properly. A line connected to blood. A line connected to corruption. A line connected to the giants remembered in the wider Enochic and Jubilees tradition. Before we move deeper, weary soul, if this kind of ancient study is becoming part of the way your night grows quieter, subscribe if you like, so these long readings are easy for you to find again. And if one detail from Noah's world already stays with you, you can carry it into the comments below, because what comes next is the part that changes the feeling of the whole story, not the names of the sons, the warning placed upon them. And once you hear where that warning survives, you may never hear the post-flood silence in quite the same way again. The standard retelling of Noah feels complete, but the Ethiopian preserved tradition reveals a missing layer. Noah's direct instruction about the corruption that once filled the earth. There is a particular kind of incompleteness that does not announce itself. It does not feel like a broken sentence. It feels like a smooth sentence that never tells you what else once stood beside it. That is the kind of incompleteness we are dealing with tonight. When most people hear Noah's story in church, or in summary, or in childhood memory, they do not feel a gap. The narrative lands with force. Creation falls into corruption. The flood comes. The ark preserves. The covenant appears. The nation spread. Nothing about that sounds unfinished. And yet ancient textual tradition has a way of standing beside familiar scripture and saying, yes, that is true, but listen longer. The Ethiopian biblical world does this with unusual patience, not by tearing Genesis apart, not by denying the sacred shape people already know, but by preserving related literature that keeps the moral background in view. Literature that remembers what sort of disorder filled the earth before the flood, and why the generations after Noah needed more than relief. They needed instruction. This is where the Book of Jubilees becomes essential. In chapter 7, after the vineyard episode, after the strained family moment involving Noah's nakedness and Ham's dishonor, after the blessings and separations, the text turns to Noah as teacher. He begins to command his sons. He exhorts them toward righteousness. He warns them away from fornication, uncleanness, and all iniquity. And then, He says why the flood came. That matters, because he does not speak of the flood as random destruction. He speaks of causes. He speaks of moral sequence. He speaks of remembered contagion. And in that remembered sequence, the text reaches backward into the older Watchers' tradition. It recalls that the flood came owing to corruption, owing to forbidden unions, owing to violent offspring, owing to bloodshed that filled the earth. Jubilees 7 does not leave the pre-flood horror vague. It ties the catastrophe to specific kinds of transgression, including the Watchers, the giant offspring, and the spread of violence across the earth. Now here is where many listeners feel the floor shift a little beneath them, because once Noah begins teaching in that chapter, this is no longer simply a story about what God did. It becomes a story about what Noah wants the next generation never to become. That is the missing layer. The flood is not only an ending, it is a warning carried forward in speech. And the recipients of that warning are the very sons through whom the world will widen again. The text says, Noah exhorted his descendants to observe righteousness, to guard their souls from uncleanness, and then explicitly ties the flood to the sins of the Watchers and their offspring. It continues by describing escalating bloodshed, the Nephilim, the giants, and widespread human violence filling the earth. I want to slow down over one word here. Witness. Noah is not merely a survivor in this scene. He is a witness to judgment, a witness to what ungoverned appetite becomes, a witness to the fact that evil can spread across levels of creation until the earth itself seems saturated with it. And if that is true, then his speech to his sons cannot be reduced to ordinary family advice. It is testimony under the shadow of memory. This is one reason the Ethiopian preservation of Jubilees matters so much, because Meshafeh Kufale did not simply preserve an extra anecdote, it preserved a moral bridge, a bridge between the world before the flood and the world after it, a bridge between giants as ancient terror and ordinary human conduct in the generations that follow, a bridge between cosmic rebellion and the very practical command not to shed blood and not to consume blood. The word here is Meshafeh Kufale in Ge'ez. Meshaf means book, a written witness, something carried. Kufale means divisions, ordered portions of sacred time. Historically, Jubilees survives most fully in Ethiopic transmission, though fragments of the work were also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing it belonged to a much older Second Temple world than many modern readers realize. And tonight, that matters because this preserved book does not allow the flood story to become morally vague. It keeps the warning attached. And I will tell you honestly, this part always makes me listen more carefully, because the danger no one names does not feel ancient only. It feels recurring. By the time the passage reaches its central warning, Noah says that demons have begun their seductions against his sons and their children, and he fears that after his death they too will shed human blood upon the earth. The chapter then warns that the one who sheds man's blood and the one who eats blood will be destroyed from the earth. That is not decorative detail. That is not background texture. That is the line of inheritance. And now we begin to understand the title more precisely. 3 sons, not standing at a neat restart of history, but receiving a severe inheritance of memory. One omitted line, not omitted because it is weak, but omitted in practice because so few people are taught to hear Noah through Jubilees. And giants, not as fantasy decoration, but is part of the remembered chain of corruption that makes Noah's warning necessary. The Book of Giants strengthens this wider memory world. Its earliest forms survive in fragmentary Aramaic copies from Qumran, and the work expands the pre-flood story of the Watchers and their giant offspring. Among the named giant figures in that tradition are Hahyah, Hahyah, and Mahwe, all tied to dreams, fear, and coming judgment. Now, we must be careful. Jubilees chapter 7 is not the same book as the Book of Giants, and we should not force one text to say what another says. But the traditions stand near one another. They breathe the same storm-heavy air. They remember the same ruined age before the flood. And together they help us hear why Noah would speak to his sons with such urgency after the waters had already gone down. Because if the old world fell through bloodshed, corruption, and the spread of violent appetite, then the new world must be guarded first at the level of conduct, at the table, in the body, in desire, in the treatment of life, in the refusal to normalize blood. That is the turn many modern summaries never let you feel. The giant story is not there merely to fascinate. It is there to explain the moral terror behind Noah's command. And once that becomes clear, 3 sons no longer look like names at the edge of a genealogy. They look like men standing before their father with the whole future of humanity pressing against his words. And now, let me take you a little further into what happens next. We will open the Ethiopian thread more fully. We will go closer to the preserved wording, closer to Noah's warning, and closer to the strange truth that a flood may wash the ground, while still leaving memory in need of guardians. The preserved Ethiopian manuscript tradition opens the path to the omitted line, and the listener is brought from familiar Noah memory into the Ge'ez witness that carried the warning forward. There is a difference, a weary soul, between a story being famous and a story being fully carried. Some stories become famous because they survive in short forms. They travel well in summary. They fit inside sermons. They fit inside childhood memory. They fit inside paintings and stained glass and the neat architecture of retelling. But some details survive differently, not because they were shouted more loudly, because they were copied more carefully, preserved by hands that did not trust speed, held inside traditions that allowed old material to remain strange instead of forcing it to become tidy. That is where the Ethiopian thread begins to matter tonight. Because when we say that a line was omitted in practice, we do not always mean that someone once stood over a page and tore out a sentence in plain sight. More often, it means whole libraries narrowed, whole reading habits simplified, whole branches of Christian memory learned to carry certain biblical stories without their older companions. And once that happens for long enough, absence starts to feel natural. People stop sensing the room that used to exist around the verse. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition is one of the places where that narrowing did not happen in the same way. Its scriptural world remained broader. Its manuscript memory continued to carry works that much of the Western Church eventually left outside ordinary use. And among those works stands the book we need tonight, Jubilees. In Ge'ez tradition, it is called Meshafe Kufale. Mashhaf means book, a written witness, something worthy to be borne forward. Kufale means divisions, ordered portions, sacred history, measured and arranged. The title itself feels important because the book does exactly that. It divides familiar time into finer lines. It measures stories that later readers often take in broad strokes. It asks you not merely to know what happened, but to remain long enough to understand how sacred memory arranged what happened. Historically, this matters because Jubilees was preserved in complete Ethiopic form, while fragments of the same work were also found at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Ethiopia was not inventing a late fantasy. It was sheltering an old witness with roots deep in the Second Temple world. That old continuity matters to me, because a preserved text feels different when you realize it is not floating alone in religious imagination, but standing inside a larger ancient conversation. And tonight, the Ethiopian thread is not merely a background fact. It is the road itself. Without it, the warning Noah gives after the flood becomes thinner. With it, the air thickens again. The family scene gains gravity. The silence after the waters no longer sounds empty. It sounds guarded. It sounds watched over by memory. I want you to picture the movement carefully. Not the whole history of Ethiopia all at once. Not a lecture hall. Not a map covered in arrows. Just one simple act repeated across generations. A manuscript opened. A page copied. A line not discarded. A warning kept near. A reader centuries later discovering that Noah says more than expected. A church refusing to treat certain ancient books as disposable. This is one of the graces of old textual traditions. They remind us that what later audiences call obscure may once have been ordinary reading in another sacred world. What feels marginal to one branch of memory can remain central in another, and that alone should make us slower before we use the word lost. Sometimes a thing is not lost. Sometimes it has simply been kept by people we learned too late to listen to. The Ethiopian church listened differently. It carried Enoch. It carried Jubilees. It carried a wider memory of the world before the flood. And because of that, when Noah begins to instruct his sons in Jubilee 7, he does not sound like a decorative echo of Genesis. He sounds like a father speaking inside a still-living archive of catastrophe. That phrase feels right to me. A still-living archive of catastrophe. Not catastrophe as spectacle. Catastrophe as instruction. Catastrophe as moral memory. Catastrophe as something that leaves behind commands. A flood does not leave only mud and driftwood. It leaves interpretation. It leaves the question of what must be remembered if ruin is not to return. And this is where the Ge'ez witness becomes especially beautiful. Because Ge'ez is not simply an old language for museum glass. It is the language through which these texts continued to be prayed, copied, guarded, and heard. A language can become a shelter. A language can become a chamber where a warning continues to breathe after other rooms grow quiet. A language can become a long obedience of ink. The word here is Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of the Ethiopian church, a language of scripture, chant, prayer, commentary, and manuscript endurance. And tonight, that matters because the warning about blood and corruption reaches us through that shelter. And I will tell you honestly, I feel gratitude whenever a language keeps alive a moral seriousness that later readers might otherwise never hear. Now, let the scene narrow again. Noah is no longer only the man in Genesis 9. He is the elder in Jubilees 7, the one who begins to enjoin upon his descendants ordinances and commandments, the one who speaks not only of blessing, but of cause, the one who tells the next generation why the flood came. That phrase matters. Why the flood came. Because when a father tells his sons why ruin fell on the earth, he is doing more than explaining history. He is creating a boundary. He is drawing a line of refusal. He is saying, there is a way of living that summons destruction. Do not walk back into it. Do not become casual about the very current that once drowned the world. And this, is where the Ethiopian preserved tradition becomes so quietly severe. It does not let the flood become abstract. It names fornication. It names uncleanness. It names bloodshed. It remembers the watchers. It remembers violent offspring. It remembers the earth filling with corruption. It keeps moral sequence attached to catastrophe. And because it does, Noah's later warning to his sons sounds less like general advice and more like the final guardrail before history widens again. There are old passages that feel like windows. This one feels more like a warning bell carried through stone corridors. Not loud, not frantic, but unmistakable once heard. And the reason we must begin here, in the Ethiopian thread, is that otherwise the omitted line might feel isolated. It is not isolated. It belongs to a preserved atmosphere, a preserved moral logic, a preserved world in which Noah's speech sits close to Enochic memory instead of far away from it. That closeness matters for giants too. Because the giant traditions do not appear here as ornamental mythology sprinkled over Genesis, they form part of the remembered explanation for why the earth became unbearable, why violence intensified, why blood became a sacred problem, why the survivors of the flood needed more than fresh air and open land. They needed disciplined memory. And when I think about that, I do not think first of libraries. I think of households, because all of this comes down, in the end, to a father speaking to his sons, to the transfer of warning from one generation to the next, to the hope that memory, rightly carried, might prevent imitation. That is where we are going next. Not yet to the full line, not yet to the deepest warning, but to the man himself, to Noah after the flood, to the father on the far side of judgment, to the elder who has planted a vineyard, buried shame in his own tent, seen fracture among his sons, and still must speak. Because what he says next does not rise from theory. It arises from survival. Stay with me, because what comes next carries a deeper meaning. We will stand beside Noah after the waters have withdrawn and listen to the kind of man judgment leaves behind. Noah is presented not as a distant icon, but as an aging father on the far side of catastrophe, carrying memory, shame, judgment, and responsibility as he turns toward his sons. The hardest part of a catastrophe is not always the moment it arrives. Sometimes the harder part is what comes after, the long after, the living after, the ordinary mornings that follow a judgment so large it rearranged the earth. I think Noah is often denied that long after. We remember him building. We remember him obeying. We remember him entering the ark with trembling animals and measured faith. We remember the rain and the deep opening beneath the world. But once the ground dries, many retellings hurry away. They take the covenant sign and leave the man. They keep the rainbow and forget the aging father standing under it. The old texts do not hurry quite so much. In Jubilees 7, Noah plants vines on the mountain where the ark had rested, identified as Lubar, one of the mountains of Ararat. The detail is earthy, slow, almost domestic. Planting, waiting, watching, gathering fruit, making wine, preparing sacrifice. This is not grand spectacle. It is a survivor returning to rhythms of time. That slowness matters, because it tells you that Noah is not preserved as a floating symbol. He returns to agriculture. He handles fruit and seasons and altars and the labor of ordinary days. He becomes a man on land again, a man who must re-enter created life after having watched nearly all created life perish. I want to remain close to that. Noah, comes ashore into a world that has been emptied by judgment. Everything familiar is altered. The mountains are still mountains, but they are no longer innocent to him. The sky is blue again, but he knows what it looked like when heaven itself seemed to pour sentence. The earth can receive seed again, but he remembers what it means for earth to receive blood. And then there is the strange tenderness of the vineyard. A vine requires patience. A vine assumes future seasons. A vine is an act of confidence after devastation. That alone moves me, because a man who plans after surviving a flood is telling you something without words. He is saying, I will live forward. I will not treat survival as the end of my duty. I will prepare for time to continue. I will cultivate what can grow in judged ground. But old scripture is honest enough not to make Noah into polished marble. He drinks. He becomes drunk. He lies uncovered. Ham sees and tells. Shem and Japheth walk backward and cover their father without looking upon his shame. The seeing is painful precisely because it is so human. Even after cosmic judgment, the household is not beyond fracture. Even after deliverance, dignity can still be exposed. Even after the ark, shame can still enter the tent. Why does that matter for tonight's story? Because it means Noah's warning to his sons will not come from a flawless distance. It will come from wounded nearness, from a father who has both seen judgment and experienced humiliation, from a patriarch whose authority still carries real gravity, but whose humanity is not concealed from us. I think that is one reason his later words carry so much force. They are not the speech of a man untouched by weakness. They are the speech of a man who knows what disorder feels like both cosmically and domestically. He has seen the world fail. He has seen a family fracture. He has seen the need for covering. He has seen how quickly shame can spread from one gaze to another. That atmosphere surrounds the later warning more than many readers notice. The speech to the sons does not rise from an untouched paradise after the flood. It rises from a new world, already showing old cracks. That matters, because evil rarely announces its return with full volume. It often returns first as exposure, contempt, division, envy, and the failure to protect what is vulnerable. Noah has already seen enough to recognize the pattern. This is why I do not hear Noah in Jubilees as merely ceremonial. I hear him as watchful, aging, severe because he must be, not because he delights in fear, but because he knows what happens when certain boundaries dissolve. A man who has outlived the world is not casual about the first signs of decay in the next one. The name here is Lubar. In Jubilees, it is the mountain on which the ark came to rest. That detail anchors the story in remembered place rather than abstraction. And tonight, that matters because sacred warning always arrives somewhere, not nowhere. It comes to sons standing near a father on actual ground. And I will tell you honestly, the more specific a text becomes about place, the more I trust its emotional seriousness. Now let us look again at the three sons, Shem, Ham, Japheth, not as names in a chart, as men shaped by the same disaster, yet not shaped identically. One covers, one exposes, one remains near, one departs displeased. Already the new world carries moral divergence. Already the family preserved through judgment is not a flawless unit. Already Noah has reason to fear what the future might become if conduct is not governed. That is why it matters that Jubilees places teaching after all this. Not before the world becomes complicated. After shame, after distance, after one brother sees differently than the others, after blessing and cursing have fallen inside the family, after cities begin to appear, after the future has already begun branching in unequal ways. So when Noah later begins instructing his descendants, the instruction is not generic. It is sharpened by experience. He has reasons now for what he says. His warnings are not vague ideals. They are the speech of someone who has watched collapse move from heaven to earth, from earth to society, from society into the body, and from the body into the household. That movement is important because the old giant traditions are not ultimately about size. They are about disorder crossing boundaries, watchers crossing their place, violence crossing its limits, appetite crossing into desecration, blood crossing into the common life of the earth until the ground itself must answer for it. Once you hear that, Noah's later commands about blood stop sounding like isolated rules. They begin to sound like the moral architecture of a father trying to prevent the return of an older ruin, a ruin he did not merely study, a ruin he survived. And imagine how such a father would look at his sons, not sentimentally, not coldly, but with that mixture only older survivors know. Love joined to caution, hope joined to vigilance, tenderness joined to memory. He wants them to live. He wants their line to spread across the earth. But he does not assume that future generations will naturally choose wisdom. He knows too much for that. That knowledge is one of the quiet burdens of elders in Scripture. The ones who have lived long enough to witness both mercy and collapse rarely speak in easy tones. Their words carry layers. Noah's certainly do, especially here, especially when the Ethiopian preserved tradition lets him explain what brought the flood in the first place. Before we reach those words, let this picture settle. An old man, a mountain, a vineyard, a family not without fracture, a future beginning under the shadow of remembered violence. A world saved, but not yet simple. This is not the clean reset modern imagination sometimes prefers. This is harder, a beginning that knows what endings cost. In one sense, Noah stands here like the first post-catastrophe pastor, a witness who must tell the next generation what happened, why it happened, and how not to walk back into it. That is not mere recollection. That is stewardship. That is the burden of the spared. And now we are ready for the line itself to begin opening. Because once Noah starts speaking in Jubilees 7, we discover that the flood story does not end with rescue. It moves into command. It moves into testimony. And then, in language many listeners have never been taught to hear, it brushes against giants. Now listen closely. The story doesn't end here. The warning itself begins to surface. And we will hear how Noah links the flood to uncleanness, violence, and the memory of beings the old world never forgot. Noah's instruction in Jubilees 7 is opened directly, and the listener hears the warning unfold from righteousness into a remembered chain of corruption that includes the watchers and giant offspring. Now we come close enough to hear Noah not merely as a symbol, but as a speaking father. Close enough for the omitted line to stop feeling like a rumor. Close enough to realize that what many audiences remember as silence after the flood was not silence at all. In Jubilees 7, the text says that Noah began to enjoin upon his sons' sons the ordinances and commandments and all the judgments that he knew. He exhorted them to observe righteousness, to honor father and mother, to love their neighbor, to guard themselves from fornication, uncleanness, and all iniquity. Listen to the tone of that. This is not casual family conversation. This is inheritance speech. A patriarch handing down what he knows. An elder not improvising inspiration, but transmitting judgment and commandment. He is not telling stories simply to be remembered. He is shaping conduct so history will not repeat itself. He is laying down rails for a future he will not live to see. And then the chapter turns, not away from morality, but deeper into it, because Noah does not leave his sons with rules detached from reason. He tells them why the flood came. He explains cause. He does not merely point to ruins. He interprets them. This is the point where the ground under the familiar story begins to shift. Many people know that the world before the flood was wicked. Far fewer have heard Noah explain that wickedness in the language preserved here. Far fewer have heard him place the catastrophe inside a chain of transgression. Far fewer have heard the old world remembered with this much specificity. Jubilees says the flood came because of three things, beginning with the fornication of the watchers, who transgressed their appointed order, went after the daughters of men, took wives, and made a beginning of uncleanness. There it is, not hidden anymore. The warning does not begin with ordinary social disorder alone. It begins with a breach in the structure of creation, beings crossing where they should not cross, desire refusing the boundaries assigned to it. The first corruption in the chain is not merely that something bad happened among humans. It is that heaven's order was violated, and the earth received the wound. That old logic matters, because in biblical and Second Temple imagination, sin is never only private. It alters atmosphere. It stains relation. It changes what kind of world can grow afterward. It teaches the ground to bear consequences beyond a single act. And then Noah's speech goes further. The watchers begat sons. The text uses forms like Nephilim, giants, Eljo, in an escalating pattern of violence. One devours another. The giants slay the Nephil. The Nephil slay the Eljo. And the chain continues outward until mankind turns upon itself. This sequence is one of the most severe parts of the chapter. It feels like corruption multiplying until language itself struggles to name the wreckage. That sequence is the kind of thing many modern summaries leave behind. Perhaps because it is difficult. Perhaps because it is strange. Perhaps because it refuses to remain inside the cleaner lines of reduced retelling. But ancient texts were not embarrassed by moral escalation. They wanted you to feel it. They wanted you to understand that violence grows, corruption breeds, bloodshed trains the earth to expect more bloodshed. An appetite, once enthroned, rarely remains modest. And this weary soul is where the omitted line begins to show its shape, not as one isolated sentence floating apart from context, but as a thread in a severe remembered chain. Noah is not warning his sons in general because fathers tend to worry. He is warning them because the flood was the answer to a world in which transgression multiplied through bodies, generations, and the ground itself. The name here is Watchers. In the wider Enochic and Jubilees tradition, these are heavenly beings assigned a station who transgressed that station and entered forbidden union with human women. And tonight, that matters, because Noah's warning only makes full sense when you hear that his memory of the flood includes them. And I will tell you honestly, the seriousness of this old tradition always makes me slow down, because it treats moral disorder as something far more contagious than modern people often like to admit. Now let us look at the logic again. First, unlawful desire. Second, unlawful offspring. Third, mutual violence. Fourth, blood filling the earth. Fifth, judgment. That is not chaos without pattern. It is corruption with momentum. And Noah wants his sons to understand that momentum, because a surviving family is not immune merely by having survived. A flood can preserve people without erasing temptation. Judgment can reset the stage without changing the heart automatically. Noah knows this. Perhaps that is why his speech sounds so sober. He is not trying to frighten his sons with fantasy. He is trying to educate them in recurrence. Then the text sharpens further. After describing the old violence, Noah looks at his own descendants and says something almost painful in its honesty. He says that he sees their works before him and that they are not walking in righteousness, that they have begun in the path of destruction, that they are parting one from another and becoming envious. That line pierces me because it means Noah is not speaking only backward. He is speaking from what he already sees, beginning again. Not at flood scale, not yet, but in seeds, in envy, in fracture, in the first motions of human turning away from harmony. And if seeds are visible, the Father must speak before they mature. That is the omitted line's emotional world, not academic surprise, urgency, not speculative curiosity, pastoral alarm. He goes further still. Noah says he sees that demons have begun their seductions against his sons and their children, and he fears that after his death they will shed the blood of men upon the earth and be destroyed from the face of the earth. Notice how that sounds. Not like a man discussing myth at a safe distance, like a father fearing recurrence. A recurrence, not of identical flood conditions, immediately, but of the same moral current. Seduction, violence, blood, destruction. This is how ancient sacred memory works when it is still alive. It does not reduce the past to a closed museum. It lets the past lean on the present. It lets catastrophe warn the living. It lets the dead world keep speaking into the newborn one. And that is why the line has to do with giants. Not because Noah is giving his sons a fireside tale about monstrous beings, because the giant tradition belongs to the remembered explanation of why the earth became drenched in violence to begin with. To remove that background is to make Noah's command sound arbitrary. To restore it is to hear moral dread inside the warning. I want to say that plainly. The command against blood is not random. The command against blood stands inside a remembered history of blood. And the old giant traditions help explain why that memory is so charged. They are part of the atmosphere behind the Father's voice. Already you can feel where the next section is going. We have moved from the broad frame of Noah's teaching into the first hard edge of the warning. Now we must go all the way to the center, to blood, to violence, to the earth as witness, to the question of why the old texts speak as though blood does not simply disappear when spilled. Because once Noah says that part, the omitted line stops being marginal. It becomes one of the most haunting inheritances in the whole post-flood world. But there's more to this story that we must understand. We reach the center of Noah's warning itself: blood, violence, the seduction of recurrence, and the remembered shadow cast by the giants. Noah's warning reaches its center in the prohibition against bloodshed and blood-eating, revealing that the memory of giants is inseparable from the memory of a world filled with violence. There are words in Scripture that arrive softly, but once heard, they do not loosen their grip. For me, blood is one of those words, not because it is dramatic, because in the old sacred imagination, blood is never ordinary. It is life poured outward, witness made visible, a moral fact the earth itself must answer to. That is why Noah's warning in Jubilees sharpens exactly here. After recalling the watchers, the violent offspring, the spread of corruption, the seduction of demons, and the danger of recurrence, he turns toward blood with terrible clarity. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, and whoso eateth the blood of any flesh shall be destroyed from the earth. The line lands like iron. No decoration, no softening, no attempt to reduce the danger. That is not decorative law. That is survival law. The kind of law a man gives when he has seen what bloodshed becomes once it spreads unopposed. The kind of law a survivor speaks when he refuses to let the next generation call destruction normal. Now the giants stand differently in the story, not as a separate fascination, not as a side corridor for curious listeners. They stand inside the memory of how violence magnified. The watchers cross their order. The giant offspring emerge. Mutual devouring follows. The earth fills with blood. Judgment comes. Then Noah tells his sons, "Do not normalize blood. Do not join yourselves to the very current that once drowned the old world in guilt." This is where the title's force deepens for me. Because what the Ethiopian preserved tradition keeps is not merely an unusual sentence about antediluvian beings. It preserves the moral bridge between giant memory and human conduct after the flood. A bridge many listeners have never been invited to cross. And once crossed, the whole chapter sounds different, more severe, more coherent, more sorrowful. The earth itself becomes an entity in this warning. That matters. The text says the earth will not be clean from the blood shed upon it unless reckoning answers it. This gives the warning cosmic seriousness, because bloodshed is not treated as a private stain limited to victim and perpetrator. It enters the land. It burdens the world. It changes the moral atmosphere in which later generations must live. The soil remembers what polite retelling prefers to forget. I think that is one reason these old texts feel heavier than modern moral language. Modern people often speak as though evil happens inside isolated decisions. Ancient sacred literature speaks as though evil can saturate a place, a family, a people, an earth. And once you hear Noah that way, his severity no longer sounds excessive. It sounds proportionate to what he has witnessed. The word here is blood. In biblical thought, blood signifies life itself, and in traditions like Genesis, Leviticus, and Jubilees, it carries both sanctity and liability. And tonight, that matters because the prohibition is not floating in ritual isolation. It is anchored in remembered catastrophe. And I would tell you honestly, whenever a command is tied this closely to memory, I stop hearing it as mere restriction and start hearing it as mercy. Mercy. That may sound surprising here, but think of it. A father who has seen the earth collapse under violence tells his sons, "Do not make peace with blood. Do not eat it. Do not spill it. Do not train your bodies and your households to live casually beside it." That is not cruelty. That is mercy born from memory. That is restraint as love. That is law, as protection for a world still fragile under new skies. And then the giant traditions come nearer once more. The Book of Giants, in its Qumran fragments and later witnesses, preserves figures such as Oya, Hahyah, and Mawe, all entangled in dreams, dread, and the approach of judgment. We must be disciplined here. Jubilees is not quoting the Book of Giants word for word, but the two belong to the same wider moral weather. They remember the same ruined age. They keep alive the same conviction that the world before the flood became violent beyond ordinary measure. That shared weather is what matters for our title. Because when Noah warns his sons after the flood, the old giant memory remains behind his speech like thunder after lightning has passed over the hills. The storm is gone. Its charge remains. The landscape looks quieter. Its danger is not yet forgotten. And think about the emotional shape of that. The sons before him did not witness the world before the flood, as Noah did. They survived it. They crossed through judgment. But their father carries a longer memory. He remembers the reasons. He remembers the causes. He remembers the contamination that spread until destruction became righteous. So he speaks not only to what his sons have done, but to what humanity might again become if blood and violence are allowed to settle into habit. That is one of the most frightening truths in old scripture. Habit can become inheritance. A tolerated appetite can become a generation's atmosphere. Noah is trying to interrupt inheritance at the level of command. He is trying to sever the line between remembered corruption and future imitation. He is trying to keep blood from becoming ordinary speech at the table of the newly saved. This is why the chapter cares about blood eating too. To modern ears, that may sound obscure or merely ritual, but in the world of the text, blood is life. To consume blood carelessly is to cross a boundary around life itself. The warning is bodily because corruption is bodily. The warning is concrete because moral collapse always becomes concrete. One's appetite is trained to dishonor life. Larger forms of violence rarely remain far behind. And there is another sadness hidden here. Noah says he fears what will happen after his death. That phrase always lingers with me. After my death. It is the ache of every elder who knows that instruction can be given, but not forced. That warning can be handed down, but not guaranteed obedience. That children and grandchildren may still choose paths that break the heart of the one who foresaw them. In that sense, this is not only a text about giants and blood. It is a text about inheritance under threat. A father trying to save the future from an old contagion. A patriarch speaking because silence would be negligence. And now, the three sons appear again under stronger light. Shem, Ham, Japheth, no longer simply branches of future nations. Now they are hearers of a warning rooted in the deepest memory of the drowned world. And, if they hear rightly, humanity may walk more carefully. If they do not, Noah fears the pattern could begin again. The old texts are mercilessly honest. They do not flatter survivors. They do not assume that being spared means becoming holy. They insist on commandment after rescue. That may be one of the hardest lessons modern spiritual culture resists. We like the ark. We like preservation. We like covenant signs in the sky. We are slower to remain near the command that follows. But the command is where love takes responsibility for memory. Blood, violence, earth, memory, judgment. Those are the heavy nouns in this passage, and all of them press on the sons at once. Before we move on, let the scene stand in stillness. An elder speaking, three sons receiving, the new earth quiet under their feet, and behind the father's words, the whole drowned violence of the old world still moving like a dark tide in memory. And as we move forward, something powerful begins to unfold. We ask why Noah gives this warning specifically to his sons, and why the future of humanity in the text depends on what those three men do with inherited memory. Shem, Ham, and Japheth are shown not merely as survivors, but as carriers of the world's future, making Noah's warning an act of inheritance rather than simple moral commentary. If Noah had spoken these words to a crowd, they would still matter. If he had spoken them to a city, they would still carry weight. If he had spoken them to scribes centuries later, they would still deserve reverence. But he speaks them into a family line, and that changes everything, because the three sons after the flood are not random hearers. They are the hinge of the human future in the story. The world ahead is not abstract. It will move outward through households, marriages, fields, altars, disputes, inheritances, births, griefs, and buried memories carried by the descendants of these men. So if corruption is to be interrupted, it must be interrupted here, at the beginning, at the family root. That is one reason I find this passage so emotionally serious. It understands something permanent about human history. What is not confronted at the root tends to travel into the branch. What is not named in one generation often becomes atmosphere in the next. Noah seems to know this with painful clarity. Jubilees does not present the sons simply as names in a table. It presents them in relation to blessing, dishonor, separation, cities, descendants, and commandment. That continuity matters because it means the warning does not float above ordinary life. It enters it into where they live, into where they build, into what kind of people they become, into what kind of earth their descendants will inherit. Now think again about the fatherly force of this. Noah is not merely saying, the past was terrible. He is saying, the past can become prologue if you do not hear me. Do not let the destroyed world instruct you more deeply than righteousness instructs you. Do not let envy, division, appetite, and bloodshed reassemble themselves inside your line. Do not call early signs harmless simply because they are small. That is why the warning had to go to the sons, because the sons are future makers. They are not spectators to history. They are carriers of it. What they normalize will widen. What they excuse will multiply. What they refuse may finally break a chain. Their hearing matters because generations are hidden inside it. The names here are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Historically, these three stand at the center of post-flood ancestry in Genesis and Jubilees alike, but Jubilees gives their world more interpretive texture by placing them inside Noah's direct moral instruction. And tonight that matters because our title is not using three sons as decoration. It is using them as the human doorway through which the whole warning must pass. And I will tell you honestly, I cannot read this without thinking of how often the future depends on whether sons and daughters can hear a painful truth before it becomes their own habit. There is also something else. Noah's warning to the sons does not imply that giants will simply reappear in the same visible form if a rule is broken once. The text is subtler than that. It preserves the giant memory as part of the explanation of how violent corruption once grew beyond restraint. The sons need that warning because they are vulnerable to the same moral current, even if history never repeats itself in exactly the same costume. That is an important spiritual principle. Evil repeats in essence more often than in shape. The names change, the scale changes, the visible form changes, but envy, seduction, bloodlust, and desecration remain recognizably themselves. Noah wants his sons to see essence. He wants them to understand what kind of world the flood judged, so that when the early symptoms appear again, they will not call them harmless. And already, according to the text, he sees those symptoms, parting one from another: envy, demonic seduction, the risk of future bloodshed. This is what gives the chapter its ache. The new world is young, but not innocent. The saved family is alive, but not beyond temptation. The future is open, but not safe, merely because it is new. That is why the warning sounds like inheritance speech, not optional advice, an urgent bequest. A father saying, "This is what the world was. This is why it died. Do not become its children in spirit after you were spared in body." Kanabi. I find the tenderness of that almost overwhelming. Not soft tenderness, grave tenderness. the tenderness of someone who loves enough to warn, the tenderness of someone who would rather sound severe than bury the truth in pleasant language, the tenderness of someone who knows that sentimental silence can be a form of neglect, and perhaps that is the hidden dignity of this whole scene. The sons are treated as morally meaningful beings. Noah does not flatter them with the illusion that history has reset without consequence. He trusts them enough to tell them the kind of truth that can save a lineage. That is respect. That is spiritual seriousness. That is fatherhood, refusing to become performance. That makes the omitted line feel larger than a textual curiosity. It becomes part of a vision of fatherhood. A father not merely passing on land and names, but passing on moral memory. A father trying to keep the earth cleaner than the one he inherited. A father refusing to let rescue become forgetfulness. And maybe that is why this passage reaches beyond ancient history. Because every generation faces a version of the same question. What will we transmit? Only survival? Only stories of what happened? Or also the moral understanding needed to prevent repetition? Noah chooses the harder gift. He gives interpretation. He gives warning. He gives commandment. He gives memory disciplined enough to protect the future. That is why the three sons matter so much. They are not there merely to populate the world. They are there to decide what kind of world will be populated, whether the new earth will be governed by chastened memory or drift back toward familiar darkness. And now another old witness approaches from the side, not to replace Jubilees, to deepen the same remembered age, the Book of Giants. There the offspring of the Watchers are not just a collective terror. Some are named, some dream, some fear judgment, some send messengers, some already feel doom approaching. That tradition will help us hear the emotional weather behind Noah's warning even more sharply. Because once names enter the giant story, the old corruption stops feeling faceless. It becomes personal, and what is personal is harder to dismiss. Now, let us step into the next part of this journey together. We will listen to the echo from the Book of Giants itself, and hear how named giant figures deepen the dread behind Noah's post-flood command. The wider giant tradition is brought in carefully through the Book of Giants, showing how named figures and fragmentary memories deepen the emotional and moral background of Noah's warning. There are times when a fragment says more than a polished summary, not because fragments are easier, because they arrive carrying the feel of survival. They sound like voices rescued from collapse, broken at the edges, but still insistent in what they preserve. That is how the Book of Giants reaches us. Not as a tidy novel from antiquity, as fragments, as echoes, as pieces discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls and later known in adapted forms. And yet those broken witnesses preserve something crucial for tonight. They preserve the emotional weather of the world Noah is trying to keep his sons from resembling. The earliest known forms of the Book of Giants survive in Aramaic fragments from Qumran, with later versions preserving related material. The work expands the pre-flood story of the Watchers and their offspring, and stands near the wider Enochic world. That alone is important, because it means the giant memory was not a passing imagination tucked into one lonely text. It belonged to a larger and older stream of reflection about why the world before the flood became unbearable. Now we must be disciplined. The Book of Giants is not the same text as Jubilees 7. Noah's speech in Jubilees should not be flattened into another book, but the traditions illuminate one another. Jubilees tells us why the flood came and what Noah feared after it. The Book of Giants helps us feel the interior terror of that remembered age by preserving giant figures, who are no longer anonymous. Names matter. They always do. Once a tradition names someone, the moral world changes. The threat stops being shapeless. The memory gains contour. The old violence looks back at you with a face. It acquires its own dread. It can no longer be brushed aside as a vague rumor from the edges of sacred history. Among the named figures associated with the Book of Giants are Hahyah, Hahyah, and Mawe. In the surviving tradition, these giants are tied to ominous dreams, uncertainty, consultation, and the approach of divine judgment. That detail matters more than it may seem, because a named giant who dreams of judgment is not merely a monster in a legend. He is part of a moral drama, a being already standing inside the shadow of collapse, a figure who senses that heaven has answered what earth became. And this helps us hear Noah more deeply. Why does he warn his sons so sternly? Because the world before the flood was not merely bad in a generic sense. It had become spiritually distorted, violently swollen, and haunted by the consequences of boundary breaking on a scale ordinary language strains to hold. The Book of Giants does not replace that explanation. It thickens it. It lets the old age appear not only as doctrine, but as remembered dread. The name here is Mawe. In the preserved giant tradition, Mawe appears as a messenger figure sent in relation to Enoch and the interpretation of troubling dreams. And tonight, that matters because the giant world is shown not only as violent, but is already destabilized by the nearness of judgment. And I will tell you, honestly, when even the violent begin to sense doom, the moral atmosphere of a text becomes difficult to forget. There is something else here too. The Book of Giants preserves fear inside a giant world. Fear of what is coming. Fear that destruction is not rumor. Fear that dreams are revelations of an ending no power can evade. That fear gives the old pre-flood world tragic depth. It is not merely cruel. It is doomed while still resisting doom. It is proud while already trembling. It is guilty while still trying to speak back to heaven. And that, in turn, casts new light on Noah's warning. Because if the remembered age before the flood included not only corruption but foreboding, then Noah's speech after the flood is not only about preventing violence. It is about preventing humanity from walking again into a moral horizon where judgment becomes thinkable. He is trying to keep the future from acquiring the emotional weather of the drowned world. He is trying to keep his sons from inheriting not only old behavior, but old doom. Now, let the connections stand together. Jubilees says the watchers transgressed. Jubilees says giant offspring and bloodshed filled the earth. Jubilees says Noah feared his descendants might fall into the same current. The Book of Giants gives us names, dreams, fear, and the heavy psychology of an age nearing divine reckoning. Together, these witnesses do not create a fantasy universe. They create memory density. They help the omitted line feel proportionate to the world from which it came. That phrase matters to me. Memory density. Some passages in Scripture are impossible to hear well if their background has been thinned too much. Noah's warning is one of them. If you remove the giant memory entirely, the command about blood may still sound holy, but it loses some of its terror. If you restore that memory, the command begins to sound like emergency wisdom, spoken by the survivor of an ancient contagion. And notice how careful the old tradition is. It does not tell the sons to obsess over giants. It tells them how to live. That is important. The purpose of preserved terror is not fascination. It is obedience. The purpose of old catastrophe is not entertainment. It is moral clarity. The purpose of naming what once ruined the earth is to help the living refuse its return. It is to place conduct under a brighter and more sobering light. That is why the Ethiopian preserved line matters so much. It keeps the warning near conduct, near blood, near righteousness, near what a household will become, near what a future people will inherit. It does not allow the giant memory to become free-floating mythology. It tethers memory back to moral life. So when we hear the names Oya or Hahyah or Mawe, we are not stepping out of Noah's world. We are stepping deeper into its remembered background. We are listening to the echoes of what his sons needed to understand without necessarily hearing every fragment by name. The old violence had a story. The old corruption had a genealogy. The old judgment had reasons. And the fragments, though broken, still preserve enough to make the warning breathe. Perhaps that is the quiet mercy of fragmentary texts. They do not let the past become harmless. Even in broken form, they keep enough of its shape for warning to remain serious, enough of its contour for memory to remain awake, enough of its human dread for later generations to hear more than a bare command. Before we move on, let the fragmentary world stand before you. Qumran caves, Aramaic lines, names surviving, in pieces, dreams moving through giant minds, judgment nearing, and far later, in Ethiopic preserved Jubilees, an old father still telling his sons how never to walk toward that kind of world again. That is the echo, not identical wording, not forced harmonizing, an echo, a deep background resonance. And once you hear it, Noah's warning sounds fuller, older, heavier, more necessary. So don't lose focus, because the next part reveals something important. We will gather all of this into one quiet question. What kind of inheritance is a warning? And what does it mean for the future of the world to begin with memory instead of innocence? Next, we turn from the preserved fragments toward the human heart of the matter, the inheritance of warning itself. The warning Noah gives is gathered into its human meaning. The future begins not with innocence, but with instructed memory, and that changes the meaning of survival itself. Now we come to the quieter question beneath all the others. Not only what the line says, not only where it survived, not only how the giant memory deepens it, but what kind of inheritance a warning really is. Because most people think of inheritance in solid things: land, name, animals, blessing, a house, a field, a known place in the world. And all of that matters. Scripture is never careless about households or lineages or the labor by which one generation leaves something behind for the next. But old sacred history knows another kind of inheritance too. The inheritance of memory, rightly interpreted. The inheritance of danger, named before it becomes custom. The inheritance of a father refusing to let survival be the only thing his sons remember. I think that is what Noah is doing in this passage. He is not handing Shem, Ham, and Japheth a cheerful story about how their family endured while others did not. He is handing them a severe memory of what ruined the earth. He is saying, in effect, if you remember only that we were saved, you will not remember enough. You must also remember what kind of world made salvation necessary. You must remember what kind of corruption filled the ground with blood. You must remember how appetite crossed its bounds and taught violence to multiply. You must remember what I saw. That changes the emotional temperature of the whole post-flood world. Because the future here does not begin in innocence. It begins in instructed memory. The sons do not inherit a blank page. They inherit a charged one. They inherit fields and commands together. They inherit blessing and warning together. They inherit a world washed clean in one sense, and yet still morally fragile in another. That is why the omitted line matters so much. Without it, the story after the flood can sound like relief with a rainbow over it. With it, the story becomes more searching. The rainbow is still there. Mercy is still there. But mercy now stands beside commandment. Covenant stands beside instruction. And the Father standing under the new sky speaks as though the future must be taught how not to become the past. I find that profoundly human, because every serious parent, every serious elder, every serious shepherd of souls eventually learns this truth. Love is not only the gift of comfort. Love is also the gift of naming what destroys. Love does not only say, "You are safe now." Love also says, "This is what must never be welcomed again." Love does not only shelter. Love instructs. Love remembers aloud. Perhaps that is why Noah's speech feels so alive. It is not theoretical morality. It is fatherhood under the pressure of history. A man looking at the future, embodied in his sons, and knowing that the world ahead will be shaped by what they normalize, what they permit, what they fear, what they refuse, and what they pass on further down the line. That is an unbearable amount of responsibility if you think about it too long. Maybe that is why old patriarchs often sound grave. They are carrying more than private feeling. They are carrying generations not yet born. And there is another tenderness here. A warning is a strange inheritance because it can sound like heaviness when first received. A young heart often wants blessing without burden, promise without caution, future without memory. But the older you become, the more you begin to understand that warnings are among the most merciful gifts the wise can leave behind. A warning is love that has already paid attention. A warning is the form memory takes when it wants to protect rather than merely grieve. A warning is sorrow made useful. That phrase stays with me. Sorrow made useful. What else is Noah doing here? He cannot undo the drowned world. He cannot erase what he has seen. He cannot promise that his sons will obey every word he speaks. But he can make his memory useful. He can shape it into command. He can turn catastrophe into moral clarity. He can give the next generation something better than vague fear. He can give them discernment. And that is why this passage reaches beyond the ancient world, because the question hidden inside it is still one of the great human questions. What do we owe the future? Do we owe it only optimism, only prosperity, only expansion? Or do we owe it truthful memory? Do we owe it the courage to say what ruins people, households, and lands if left unchecked? Do we owe it commands that feel inconvenient in the short term but merciful in the long run? Noah's answer is clear. The future must not be fed on amnesia. It must be trained by remembrance, and not remembrance as nostalgia. Remembrance as moral orientation. Remembrance that knows where the old world went wrong. Remembrance that can detect the first return of envy, seduction, blood, and disdain for life's boundaries. That is the inheritance of warning. And that is why the three sons matter so much. They are not merely the first generation after judgment. They are the first custodians of post-judgment memory. What they do with that memory will affect the moral weather of everything that comes after. So let this settle before we move any farther. Noah did not only survive the flood, he interpreted it for his sons, and in doing so, he gave them something heavier than comfort. He gave them a future guarded by truth. In a moment, weary soul, we will pause the study just long enough to speak more personally because there are times when a heralded warning feels less like history and more like the quiet burden of carrying too much. There are seasons when what tires a person most is not only what happened to them, but what they feel they must keep from happening again. Sometimes the heaviest thing is not pain itself. It is vigilance. It is carrying memory like a watch in the night. It is loving people enough to fear what might wound them after you are gone. If you know that feeling, weary soul, then you may understand Noah more than you realize. Not as a distant patriarch, as someone trying to hand down care in the form of warning. And if that has been your burden too, may this night hold you gently for a little while. The script returns to the manuscript trail and shows how the Ge'ez tradition kept Noah's warning near the life of the church, preserving a broader memory world in which the omitted line remained intelligible. Now we return to the manuscript path itself, because the question is no longer only what Noah said. It is how that saying remained audible, how it stayed near enough for later generations to hear, how a warning survives the long weather of history without being dissolved into summary. This is where Ge'ez becomes more than a linguistic footnote. It becomes a vessel, a shelter, a continuity of listening. When people speak quickly about the Ethiopian biblical tradition, they sometimes reduce it to a curiosity, as though it were simply the place where a few unusual books happened to remain. But that is far too small a way to describe what preservation means. Texts do not survive by accident alone. They survive because communities pray them, copy them, teach them, bind them, chant them, comment on them, and receive them as worthy of continued attention. A manuscript tradition is never only about paper and ink. It is about reverence organized over time. That is why the Ge'ez world matters for tonight's title. Because in that world, Jubilees was not merely an eccentric relic sitting at the edge of theological memory. It remained part of a wider sacred landscape in which Enochic and related traditions were still close enough to one another for Noah's warning to retain its full atmosphere. When a tradition keeps Jubilees near Enoch and keeps both within the orbit of living religious memory, the line about blood and corruption does not sound detached. It sounds proportionate. It sounds like it belongs to a remembered world. Ge'ez carried that remembered world. And I do not only mean vocabulary. I mean cadence. I mean continuity. I mean the patient refusal to allow sacred history to become flatter than it once was. The word here is meshaf, book, writing, a carried witness. Ge'ez carried that remembered world. And I do not only mean vocabulary. I mean cadence. I mean continuity. I mean the patient refusal to allow sacred history to become flatter than it once was. The word here is meshaf, duk, writing, a carried witness. That meaning matters because a book in the old religious imagination was never only information stored. It was testimony entrusted, something preserved because letting it vanish would also let vanish a certain form of seriousness. And Noah's warning needs seriousness around it. Without seriousness, it becomes odd. With seriousness, it becomes luminous in a stern way. Historically, the complete text of Jubilees survived above all in Ethiopic, while fragments of Jubilees were also found at Qumran, confirming that the work belonged to a much older Jewish textual world than many later readers assumed. That historical bridge is important. It means the Ethiopian tradition was not fabricating a late obsession with giants or blood or hidden warnings. It was preserving an ancient witness whose roots reach back toward the same Second Temple landscape that treasured Enochic literature more broadly. And once that becomes clear, the line in Jubilees 7 feels less like an anomaly and more like a preserved chamber in a once wider house. I think about that house often, not literally a building, a house of memory. Rooms once connected, texts once heard in relation to one another, images and warnings and genealogies and judgments moving through the same sacred imagination. While later centuries sometimes separated, earlier readers may have held nearer together. And the Ethiopian scriptural world often preserves something of that nearness. That nearness matters here, because Noah's warning against blood only fully burns when the listener still feels the heat of the world before the flood. If the background is cooled too much, the command seems merely ritual. If the background remains alive, the command becomes a mercy of enormous weight. Gu'e's preservation helped keep that background alive. It kept a warning in a world where the watchers had not been forgotten so thoroughly. It kept the flood tied to remembered causes. It kept Noah's fatherly instruction from sounding like an isolated rule detached from catastrophe. And there is something deeply moving to me about the fact that a language can do this. A language can be more than a tool of speech. It can become a form of guardianship. It can protect not just words, but relation between words. Not just a sentence, but the emotional and theological horizon that makes the sentence intelligible. That is what I feel Gu'e is doing here. Not merely storing Noah's command, protecting the world around the command. The Ethiopian manuscript world also matters because it did not force every ancient line into the narrowest possible reading habit. It allowed older literature to keep breathing. That does not mean every text functioned in the same way or with the same weight in every context, but it does mean the memory field remained wider. And a wider memory field is often exactly what a difficult warning needs. The more a tradition remembers, the less likely it is to mishear a severe line as arbitrary. This is one reason I am grateful for manuscript traditions that do not hurry. Haste usually protects clarity only in the short term. Over centuries, haste can become erasure. Communities that move too quickly towards simplification often lose the ability to hear why a text once mattered. The line survives perhaps in outline, but its pulse weakens. Something like that happened in many reading cultures around Noah. The ark remained strong. The animals remained memorable. The rainbow remained beautiful. But the inherited warning about the moral logic of the flood grew less audible. Gu'e's helped keep it audible. And because it did, the post-flood world in Jubilees still feels morally charged. Noah still sounds like a father who remembers too much to speak lightly. The sons still stand inside a future that can go wrong. Blood still carries sacred danger, and giants remain part of the remembered explanation for why the command must be as severe as it is. The Gu'e's title, Meschafa Kufale, also reminds us that this is a book of divisions, of measured portions of sacred history. That phrase matters tonight, because what Noah gives his sons is also division, a dividing line between one kind of world and another, one kind of appetite and another, one kind of humanity and another. A line meant to say, the old world crossed too many boundaries. You must not cross them again. I will tell you, honestly, there is something in that which feels pastorally true, far beyond the ancient setting. People often imagine that love blurs lines. Sometimes, real love draws them, not to imprison life, to preserve it. Noah's warning is a drawn line. Gu'e's preserved the line, and because it did, we can still hear the Father trying to keep the future from entering the old ruin by another door. So, now, hold the manuscript thread and the family thread together. A community of scribes and believers keeps a book. A book keeps a warning. A warning keeps alive the memory of why the flood came. And that memory is handed from a father to his sons. Preservation outside and transmission inside. The manuscript and the household doing the same kind of holy work, both refusing forgetfulness. That is why this section matters before our final synthesis. Because once you understand how Ge'ez kept the warning intact, you begin to see that the omitted line is not only a missing sentence in modern hearing, it is part of a larger question. What happens to a civilization when it loses the moral background of its own most famous stories? What happens when Noah is remembered as rescued, but not as warning? What happens when the flood is remembered as spectacle, but not as diagnosis? We answer that next, because one preserved line can change the meaning of the whole post-flood story. And once you hear that change clearly, the new world after the ark will never sound quite so simple again. The full significance of the omitted line is gathered. Noah's post-flood world is revealed as morally vigilant rather than cleanly reset, and the entire story of the three sons is reinterpreted through inherited warning. Now we can say it plainly. One omitted line changes the whole story, not because it adds drama, because it restores proportion. It returns weight to a world we have often remembered too cleanly. Without the wider witness preserved in Jubilees, the post-flood scene can feel almost ceremonial. The ark rests, the family emerges, the covenant appears, the generations continue. The story becomes a bridge from catastrophe to continuity. And that is true as far as it goes. But it does not go far enough. Once Noah's warning is restored to hearing, continuity is no longer the whole mood. Continuity now lives beside vigilance. Beginning now lives beside memory. The three sons no longer stand at the edge of a simple restart. They stand inside a morally charged inheritance. They are not merely recipients of tomorrow. They are guardians against yesterday. That changes everything. It changes Noah. He is no longer only the obedient ark builder preserved through judgment. He becomes the interpreter of judgment for the next generation. He becomes the man who tells his sons why the world drowned. He becomes a father who understands that rescue without instruction can become forgetfulness. He becomes someone who knows that a spared family can still reproduce the spirit of the destroyed world if it does not hear the moral meaning of what happened. It changes the sons. Shem, Ham, and Japheth are no longer merely names from which nations unfold. They become hearers of a severe bequest. Their role in the story deepens from ancestry to responsibility. They are entrusted with more than future fertility. They are entrusted with remembered boundaries. They must carry not only life forward, but discernment forward. It changes the flood. The flood is no longer only a divine act in the past. It becomes a moral grammar for the future, a revelation of what corruption becomes when left to widen, a testimony that certain violations are not small simply because they begin quietly. The flood becomes something Noah must teach from, something the saved cannot afford to romanticize or forget. It changes the place of giants in the story. The giants are no longer merely strange beings at the edge of ancient imagination. They become part of the explanatory pressure behind Noah's warning. They belong to the remembered chain of disorder, violence, appetite, and bloodshed that made the old world unbearable. That does not mean the whole story is about them. It means the warning makes fuller sense when their memory is restored to its proper place. The old world was not judged for trivial disorder. It was judged for a corruption severe enough to deform the relation between heaven, earth, body, blood, and law. It changes the command about blood. Without the omitted line's larger background, the blood command can sound merely ritual or symbolic. With the background restored, it becomes urgent moral medicine. Noah is not simply handing down a rule. He is drawing a protective boundary around life itself. He is saying, the old world normalized what should never have been normalized. Do not allow that spirit back into yours. He is saying, if blood becomes common to you, then reverence has already begun to thin. And where reverence thins, violence learns to breathe more easily. It changes the meaning of memory. Memory here is not passive recollection. It is active guardianship. It is truth preserved for the sake of restraint. It is catastrophe turned into command so that love may protect what fear alone never could. This is why the line matters so much to me, because it shows us memory doing holy work. Memory is not keeping people trapped in yesterday. Memory is keeping tomorrow from becoming yesterday again. And perhaps, most of all, it changes the emotional weather of the new earth. That phrase has stayed with me all night. The emotional weather of the new earth. We often imagine the world after the flood as clean air, mountain silence, covenant light, and open horizons. And no doubt, there was such beauty. But the restored line tells us there was something else in the air too. Sobriety, a father's concern, moral caution, the knowledge that history can begin again without yet becoming wise. The knowledge that salvation does not abolish the need for commandment. That is a harder beauty, a more adult beauty, a beauty that does not confuse mercy with forgetfulness, a beauty in which grace and warning stand side by side. And to me, that beauty feels truer than the simplified version, because life itself often works that way. We are preserved through something, and then we must learn how to live so that the thing we survived does not quietly rebuild itself inside us. I think that is why this old line reaches so far beyond its page. Every household knows some version of this question. Every people does. What will we remember rightly enough to keep from repeating? What ruin will we interpret before it returns as habit? What will we hand down besides bare survival? Noah's answer is one omitted line, long and a whole world wide. He hands down warning. He connects blood to judgment. He connects conduct to catastrophe. He connects the future of his sons to the memory of a drowned world. And in doing so, he reveals that the flood story was never only about getting through the storm. It was also about learning how not to deserve the storm again. That sentence may be as close as we can come to the heart of it. The story is not only about getting through the storm. It is also about learning how not to deserve the storm again. That is why the Ethiopian preservation matters, because it kept this moral center from dissolving entirely into outline. It kept the father speaking. It kept the sons listening. It kept the blood warning joined to the memory of giants and violent corruption. It kept a difficult truth near enough to still do its work. And that work is not meant to make the listener anxious without end. It is meant to clarify. That is an important distinction. Sacred warning is not panic. It is illumination severe enough to become mercy. Noah is not trying to trap his sons in dread. He is trying to free them from repetition. He is trying to guard the earth they will inhabit. He is trying to keep their descendants from inheriting a violence they never had to choose. I hear tenderness in that, a hard tenderness. A father who will not flatter the future. A father who refuses to call history harmless. A father who knows that love must sometimes sound like restraint. And perhaps That is what has moved me most in this old preserved witness. Not only that the line survived, but that the line survived in a form that still sounds like care. Severe care, but care. So now, let the whole pattern stand before you one last time. 3 sons, a father after judgment, a warning about blood, the remembered corruption of the old world, the shadow of giants behind the command. A good preserved witness carrying all of this forward, and one omitted line changing the meaning of everything around it. This is the part I wanted to bring you to. Not novelty for its own sake. Not a hidden fact merely because hidden facts are exciting, but a recovered proportion, a fuller hearing, a more truthful Noah, a more fragile new world, a more serious mercy. The study has carried us as far as it needs to go tonight. The line has been heard. The warning has done its work. The Father has spoken. And now, weary soul, we do not need to push deeper into thought. We can let the meaning settle. We can let the mind unclench its grip. We can move from the page into rest. Let the teaching settle into your bones now, not as strain, but as something gently placed down. The study is finished for this part of the night. The old words have said what they needed to say. The warning has been heard. The storm has been remembered. And now you do not need to keep tracing every line of it. You do not need to analyze anything more. You do not need to hold every name in place. You do not need to keep watch over the page. The page can rest. The mind can soften. The body can become the place of the next listening. From this moment, we are leaving explanation behind. No more teaching. No more searching. No more gathering details. Only the voice. Only the quiet. Only the slow descent into a gentler landscape. If you wish, picture the old text closing softly, not shut in rejection, closed in peace. Its work complete for now, its warning no longer pressing for thought, only lingering like wisdom that has already found its place. And as the page closes, a garden opens, a walled garden at night, warm stone holding the last memory of day, evening birds settling into still branches, a small fountain speaking in a low and patient voice, safe enclosure, soft air, no urgency, no burden to carry for another hour. The study is done. Weary soul, and now we simply rest. Only the garden, only the night, only the quiet path ahead. You are standing at the entrance of a garden. A low stone arch rises before you, old, warm, and worn smooth by the weather of many years. Beyond it, the garden waits without demanding anything. No task, no proving, no hurry, only welcome. You step through slowly. The ground beneath your feet is even and kind, flat stone laid in long, patient lines. The last warmth of the day still lives in it. Not hot, not sharp, just enough warmth to feel that the earth has not forgotten gentleness. The walls of the garden are high enough to make the place feel held, not trapped, held, the way hands may cup water without crushing it, the way a small room of prayer may hold silence without making it heavy. These walls do that for the night around you. They keep the wind from becoming restless. They soften distance. They make the air feel nearer and safer. Above the walls, the sky is deep blue, almost dark now, not black, not empty, still carrying a little color at its edges, a slow evening sky, the kind that does not disappear all at once, the kind that leaves room for the eyes to settle before the stars grow stronger. You begin to walk, one step, then another. The sound is soft. Stone underfoot, a little whisper of cloth, a breath that does not need to be managed, a body that does not need instruction for every small thing. You are already here. That is enough. Along the left wall runs a line of climbing vine. Its leaves are dark in the dimness, but now and then the night allows a little silver to rest on their edges. The vine is full, but not wild, gathered, peaceful, content to remain where it has grown. A few late blossoms still hold fragrance, not strong, not sweet in an overwhelming way, just enough to remind the air that beauty can stay quiet. There are trees inside the garden too, olive and fig. Their branches spread slowly over the path. The leaves murmur only a little when the gentlest movement of air passes through. Nothing abrupt, nothing cold, only a soft stirring high above, as though the garden itself were adjusting into deeper rest. Somewhere ahead, water is moving. You do not see it immediately. You hear it first. A small fountain, a low stream of water slipping from one stone lip into a shallow basin below. Again, and again, and again. Never loud enough to claim the whole garden. Never absent enough to leave it empty. Just a patient thread of sound running through the middle of the night. You follow that sound without needing to think. The path bends gently. A turn of pale stone. A small open place. And there in the center sits the fountain. Round basin. Smooth rim. Water clear even in the dimness. The surface catches the little light that remains and loosens it into movement. Nothing glittering. Nothing dramatic. Only a quiet shimmer that rises and falls each time the water touches itself. You move closer. The air beside the fountain is cooler by 1 degree, just enough to refresh the face. The kind of cool that asks nothing from the body except permission to relax. You rest a hand on the rim of the basin. The stone is smoother than expected, not polished by machines, softened by time, by weather, by touch, by years of being exactly where it is. The fountain does not rush. That matters. Everything in the garden seems to understand the wisdom of slowness. The water falls slowly. The leaves move slowly. The birds settle slowly. Even the fading light leaves slowly. Nothing is in conflict with the hour. The entire garden seems to know that night is not an interruption. Night is a form of mercy. There is a bench near the fountain, stone at the base, wood above. The wood is old, but sound. You sit there if you like, or simply imagine that you could. There is no rule inside this garden, except gentleness. If standing feels restful, stand. If sitting feels restful, sit. If all you want is to listen, then listen. The garden is not offended by stillness. It is built for it. Overhead, the first clearer stars begin to appear. Not many, just enough to suggest a larger calm beyond the walls. A sky that continues farther than the eye can follow, yet does not press upon you here. The garden gives you scale without threat. It lets the heavens remain wide while your resting place remains intimate. That balance is a gift. You do not need endless space when you're tired. You need safe space. This garden knows the difference. On the far side, evening birds are settling into the branches. You can hear the last small adjustments. A wing drawing inward, a branch receiving a little weight, a faint note, then quiet, another tiny note, then quiet again. Not song now, only the final language of creatures turning toward rest. The garden does not ask them to keep singing after they are tired. It lets them grow still. You may do the same. A path of finer gravel winds off toward a corner where herbs grow. Rosemary, mint, a little thyme. When the air moves, it carries their fragrance in thin, peaceful lines. Nothing crowded, nothing complicated. The scent reaches you and passes, reaches you and passes, like a reminder that good things do not always arrive in abundance. Sometimes they arrive in just enough measure to settle the heart. If you look down, you can see how the stones of the path are not perfect. Some are darker, some lighter, some carry a trace of age across them. And that imperfection makes the garden gentler. It does not gleam with newness. It rests in faithfulness. It is not trying to impress you. It is trying to receive you. The walls keep the outer world at a kind distance. You know the wider earth still exists beyond them. Roads, noise, demands, unfinished things. But here, they no longer have the same reach. The garden has reduced them, not by solving them, by placing you somewhere they cannot speak as loudly. For this hour, that is enough. Everything does not need to be resolved before rest begins. Sometimes it is enough to enter a place where the unresolved grows quiet. The fountain continues, one thread of water into another, a little pause in the ear, then the same soft rhythm returning. You begin to realize that you are breathing a little more like the fountain now, not because anyone told you to, because the body often learns from whatever is near it. And here, what is near you is unhurried, so the body remembers unhurriedness too. The night deepens by degrees. The blue above the walls becomes richer, the stars a little steadier, the leaves darker, the stone warmer where it still holds the last of the day, cooler where the shade has fully settled. You become aware of how little effort is needed to remain here. No strain in the shoulders, no argument in the jaw, no reason for the hands to grip anything. The garden is doing some of the resting for you. There is a small patch of earth beside the fountain where white flowers open only at night. Their petals are simple, no bold color, no demand for attention. They release a faint fragrance more noticeable now than before, because the whole garden has grown quieter around them. That is how some mercies work. They become easier to notice only when the louder things have finally gone still. You may imagine lying back now if you wish, not on the ground directly, but on a long, low couch beneath a fig tree where woven cloth has been spread. The cloth is cool first, then warm beneath you. The branches above are still. The air moves only enough to touch the forehead and then pass on. Nothing here startles. Nothing insists. Nothing asks you to return to thinking. The walls remain around the garden like faithful boundaries. They are not there to confine. They are there to keep peace from spilling away. There is wisdom in that. Not every boundary is a wound. Some boundaries are a kindness. Some are what make gentleness possible. Some are what allow a tired mind to stop scanning the horizon for threat. Here in this garden, the walls are kindness. You do not need to look beyond them tonight. You only need what is within. The fountain has become part of the dark now, not invisible, just blended. Its sound remains clearer than its shape. That too feels right. At night, hearing often comforts more than seeing. A known sound in the dark can be gentler than a bright image. And the water keeps speaking in that soft, continuous way that asks nothing of you except that you let it remain. A bird gives one final small note from the tree above, then settles completely. You know without seeing that its feathers are tucked close now, its small body held by branch and sleep. There is something deeply peaceful in creatures trusting the night enough to become still inside it. The garden is full of such trust. The leaves trust the dark. The stones trust the cooling air. The water trusts its basin. The birds trust the branches. And perhaps, little by little, you may trust this hour too. No need to force that trust. Only let it arrive the way the stars arrived, quietly, one at a time, without announcement, without pressure. The fragrance of the herbs drifts once more. Rosemary first, then a trace of mint, then only cool air. The sequence is so soft, you nearly miss it. Then the fountain returns to the front of hearing, then the leaves, then the wide stillness between sounds. The stillness is not empty. It is padded. It is safe. It holds the little sounds rather than swallowing them. If a thought arrives, the garden does not resist it. It simply lets the thought become quieter than the water, quieter than the leaves, quieter than the slow dark above the walls. A thought may come, then go. Another may come, then soften at the edges. You do not need to chase them away. The garden is already gentling them. The hour is already thinning their urgency. Somewhere near the back wall hangs a small lamp, not bright, not enough to divide the garden into sharp places. Only a modest amber glow near a doorway cut into the stone. It leaves more shadow than light, and because of that, it is comforting. It does not demand attention. It simply reassures the eye that warmth can remain even in dimness. Your hands are unoccupied, your brow softer now, the breath entering and leaving without instruction, the body a little heavier in the best way, a safe heaviness, a downward kindness, the kind that tells you rest is no longer far away. It is already touching the edges of you. Remain here a little longer, under the fig tree, near the fountain, within the walls, beneath the darkening blue, with evening birds already asleep and warm stone still holding one last memory of sun. There is nowhere else to be for this part of the night. Nothing else to solve. Nothing else to recover. Only the garden, and your own quiet becoming a little more willing to stay. The garden will still be here as the night deepens. The fountain will keep speaking. The walls will keep holding, and you may drift as slowly as you need. The garden remains around you. Nothing has closed. Nothing has withdrawn. It has simply grown softer. The shapes are still here, but they no longer ask to be noticed all at once. They can arrive one by one. Stone, water, leaf, air, the low wall, the fountain basin, the hush between one small sound and the next. You do not need to keep the whole garden in your mind. You may rest with one thing at a time. That is enough for this hour. More than enough. Begin with the water. Its sound has changed slightly as the night has deepened. Or perhaps you have changed. Perhaps the ear is quieter now. Perhaps the body has stopped defending itself against the day. Perhaps the heart has loosened enough to hear how patient the water really is. It falls in a soft thread, not thin in a lonely way, thin in a peaceful way, a steady line from upper stone to basin, a little rounded sound on contact, then the faintest widening ripple, then stillness gathering again, then the next falling line, again and again and again. The water does not attempt to impress the night. It does not try to become a river. It is content to remain a fountain in a walled garden, small enough to comfort, steady enough to trust, modest enough to disappear into the quiet when you no longer need to hear it directly. Now notice the stone beneath you, the stone of the walls, the stone around the basin. The stone remembers the warmth of day more slowly than the air does. It releases it in stages. A warm edge here, a cooler edge there, a softness stored in rock. You can almost feel the patience of it. Nothing hurried ever built peace like this. It took many afternoons of sun, many evenings of cooling, many rains, many seasons. The stone did not learn gentleness in a day. It learned it by remaining. If your body is lying down in the garden now, or resting in some sheltered place beneath the fig tree, you may imagine the stone near your hand, not pressing, not cold, just present, a dependable presence, a quiet witness that has no need to speak. And if some part of you is still holding the last shape of effort, let the stone teach you another shape. Not rigid, settled, not tense, grounded, not alert for danger. At home in stillness, the fountain gives a small reply, a little fall of water, a little receiving basin, then rest. Water and stone conversing without hurry, water moving, stone receiving, movement and steadiness together. Perhaps that is one reason the sound comforts. It is never only one thing. The water brings motion without anxiety. The stone brings rest without heaviness. Between them, the night learns balance. Above you, the leaves are darker now, less green than shape, less shape than shadow, and still they hold their place with such quiet dignity. One branch rests over another. The fig leaves spread broad and calm. The olive leaves turn their narrow silver inward to the dark. Nothing here competes. Nothing here tries to be first. The whole garden has accepted the wisdom of night. Less brightness, more depth, less display, more presence. A faint breath of air moves through again. Not enough to disturb the skin, just enough to let the leaves speak for a moment. A rubbing sound, a little silk against silk. Then, stillness returns. Another small motion comes a few heartbeats later from somewhere along the wall where the climbing vine rests. The night does not feel silent in the empty sense. It feels tended. Every little sound seems placed at the right distance from the next. Enough sound to keep loneliness away. Enough quiet to let sleep draw near. You may notice now how the body grows heavier in stages. The feet first, then the calves, then the thighs losing their last argument with the day, the hands unlearning their grip, the shoulders lowering by a degree so small you might miss it if the garden were not so gentle, the face softening without being told how, the tongue resting, the eyes no longer interested in holding the dark apart. Let that happen slowly. The garden is in no hurry to finish you. The garden is not trying to make sleep happen by force. It is simply making rest believable, making surrender feel safe, making stillness feel like something the body remembers rather than something it must perform. Listen again to the fountain. This time, hear the space after each fall of water. That small pause, that patient gap, that tender fraction of silence before the next drop joins the basin. Those pauses matter. The night is full of them. The garden is built of them. Perhaps your body is built for them too, not only for breath and movement and responsibility, but for pause, for the small holy gap in which nothing is being demanded. A little farther away, perhaps beyond the herb bed, a second, fainter trickle can be heard now. Maybe water running through a narrow channel cut into stone. Maybe overflow from the basin slipping into soil below. It does not matter exactly what it is, only that the sound reaches you as reassurance. A second, softer water note under the first, a hidden thread beneath the visible thread. Even the unseen parts of the garden remain peaceful. Even what you cannot locate exactly sounds safe. The lamp by the doorway has dimmed a little, or perhaps your eyes have drifted farther from the need to measure light. Its amber circle now seems smaller, more inward. It touches one section of wall, one branch of ivy, one corner of path, then lets the rest remain tenderly dark. That is enough. No place here needs strong illumination. Nothing in the garden is asking to be investigated. Nothing needs to be solved by a brighter mind. The dimness is merciful because it releases you from inspection. You are not here to examine. You are here to be held. If a last thought of the day returns, let it pass beside the fountain, rather than through the center of you. Let it drift near the wall and lose its edges there. Let it rest like a fallen leaf that no one needs to pick up tonight. Thoughts may still arrive. The garden does not punish that. But here they become lighter. They lose some of their command. They join the weather of the place and quiet down. Near the herb bed, the earth is darker from moisture. You can smell it if you wish. Clean soil, a little coolness, a little rosemary, a little mint breathing under the stone walls. The scent is so gentle it feels like memory instead of fragrance. Not a strong herb garden at noon. A soft trace of leaves after sunset. Enough to remind the body that living things around it are at rest too. The fountain keeps speaking. The walls keep holding. And the stone bench along the wall keeps offering its stored warmth back into the air. Everything in the garden gives without noise. The wall gives shelter. The basin gives song. The trees give shadow. The herbs give breath. The stone gives back the day in softened form. This is what quiet generosity looks like. Not a burst, a steady release. If you are lying beneath the fig tree, perhaps one leaf above you shifts just enough to reveal a clearer patch of sky. One star is there, then another, a little farther off. Then no need to count any more. The stars are not here to awaken wonder so much as to reassure the tired heart that the world continues in calm order above the walls. There is enough sky, enough night, enough room for your rest to be small and held within something larger than itself. That can be comforting. The garden does not isolate you from the heavens. It simply gives you a peaceful way to belong beneath them. A softness reaches the ankles now, as if the coolness of evening has finally settled all the way to the ground. Not cold, only fresher than before. The kind of air that invites blankets in imagination. The kind of air that makes warmth feel more precious where it remains in the stone and wood around you. If you picture a covering near you, a woven cloth perhaps, let it rest lightly over your legs and middle. Nothing heavy, just enough to deepen the feeling of being looked after. The water falls. The basin receives. The hidden channel whispers. A bird stirs once in the distant branch, and then remembers sleep. The leaves respond with one soft sound. Then all is still again. You do not need to do anything with these sounds. You do not need to follow them. They are already doing their work. They are lowering the mind gently. They are teaching the body that repetition can be benevolent, that not all repeated things are pressure. Some repeated things are peace. And if there is any part of you still standing somewhere outside the garden in worry, let it come inside now. It need not remain at the gate. It need not stand watch where there is nothing to defend against. Let even that part come in and sit by the fountain. Let even that part place its hands in its lap. Let even that part hear the water and believe, for a little while, that the world does not need one more vigilant mind before dawn. The stone near the basin gathers a little moonlight now, not enough to shine, just enough to show its outline. Rounded edge, smooth lip, water tracing its curve over and over. You could watch that for a long time if you wished. Yet you do not need to, because the body has already taken in the scene, already learned its lesson, already begun to slow beneath it, already become willing to be carried by simpler things. Perhaps you notice the pulse in your own body now, not as something to monitor, but as a kind companion to the fountain, a quiet rhythm inside, a quiet rhythm outside. No conflict between them. The night drawing them into gentler agreement. No need for perfection, only softness, only enough easing for rest to continue its slow approach. There is peace in how little this garden asks of you. It does not ask for insight. It does not ask for memory. It does not ask for words. It allows you to become simpler than you were in daylight. A breathing creature under branches, a resting body near water, a soul no longer standing in argument with the hour. That simplification is a mercy. So much of the day asks us to become complicated. The night, when it is kind, returns us to simpler truths. Water can soothe, stone can hold, air can cool, leaves can whisper, a body can rest. The lamp near the doorway is now just a soft idea of gold in the distance. The stars are steadier. The wall is mostly shadow. The herbs still breathe their faint fragrance. And the fountain keeps speaking in its patient syllables of water and pause, water and pause, water and pause. The body hears this. The heart hears it too. Nothing urgent remains in the sound. Nothing to brace against. Nothing to answer. If sleep wishes to come nearer now, let it approach as the air approaches stone, without announcement, without force, with natural belonging. Let it collect in you slowly, in the eyes first, then in the jaw, then in the shoulders, then in the chest and hands and knees and feet. Let it become a gathering softness instead of a task. The garden understands that kind of arrival. So may you. And if you are not fully asleep yet, that is all right. The water is still here. The stone is still here. The night has not withdrawn its patience. You may keep listening without trying. You may keep resting without measuring. You may stay in this gentle in-between for as long as you need. The garden knows how to wait without making you feel late. The garden does not sleep all at once. It rests in layers. One branch settled, then another. One corner dim, then another. One sound fading, then another. The whole place lowering itself into deeper quiet by degrees. That is a comforting way for a night to deepen. Not suddenly, gently, as though the world itself understands that tired things need kindness in stages. You are part of that deepening now, no longer simply observing the garden. You belong to its pace. The fountain has become familiar enough that the ear does not keep reaching toward it. The leaves are quiet enough that each small motion is received almost as a blessing. The walls no longer feel like a boundary you notice. They feel like a calm you are inside. That is how safety often works when it is real. At first you look for it. Then at last you begin living inside it without effort. Somewhere above the vine-covered wall, night insects move in their own small hidden pattern. Not many, only a little life at the edge of hearing. So faint that it almost falls into the dark completely. It does not disturb the peace. It completes it. The garden is not silent because nothing lives here. It is restful because everything living here has accepted the hour. The water has accepted it. The birds have accepted it. The leaves have accepted it. Even the insects move without insisting on themselves. This is what harmony sounds like when it is humble. The fig tree above you has a broad patience in it. Its branches spread low and sheltering. Its leaves are large enough to hold shadow gently. If one leaf loosens and drifts down through the dark, it does not startle. It simply lands with a sound so small, the night almost keeps it for itself. A soft arrival on stone, a softer one on earth. Then stillness once more. You do not need to look for where it fell. It is enough to know that even falling things can arrive peacefully here. There is comfort in that thought. Even falling things can arrive peacefully. Even tired things. Even thoughts that were once sharp. Even memories that seemed to have too much edge earlier in the day. In the garden, they descend differently. They lose some of their weight on the way down. They come to rest without striking hard. A little farther off, the pomegranate tree stands in the corner, quiet and full. Its fruit is hidden now by the dark, but the tree keeps its shape. Branches rising. then bending a little under what they carry, not burdened, simply full. There are forms of fullness that strain a thing. This is not one of them. This tree carries its fruit as the night carries its stars, without display, without noise, without proving anything. That kind of fullness is restful to behold. The clay bowl near the wall still holds a little still water. No bird drinks from it now. No hand reaches toward it. It exists in quiet readiness for another hour. A vessel can rest and still be useful. That too is a mercy to remember. You do not have to be in motion to matter. You do not have to be producing to belong. The bowl rests. The bench rests. The lamp rests in its small glow. The whole garden teaches this without speech. Usefulness is not always activity. Sometimes it is simply presence kept gentle. The fountain sounds softer now because you know it better. That often happens. What is unfamiliar demands more attention. What becomes trusted can remain present without effort. Perhaps the night is doing that to you too. What first felt like dimness now feels like covering. What first felt like stillness now feels like care. What first felt like slowness now feels like permission. Trust changes the shape of things. It changes even the dark. If your hands are resting at your sides or folded lightly over you, let them become even quieter, not arranged, not composed for anyone, simply quiet. Hands released from doing, hands with no gate to hold, no page to turn, no way to carry from one room into another, hands allowed to be empty. This hour honors emptiness when it is peaceful. Empty hands, an unoccupied brow, a jaw unfastened from speech, a chest no longer preparing for the next demand. The lamp by the doorway may go out later, or it may not. The garden would remain kind either way. That is another comfort. Not every sign of care must remain visible to remain real. The walls will still hold if the lamp darkens. The fountain will still fall if no one watches it. The stars will still be there above the arch. The herbs will still release their fragrance in little hidden measures. Some forms of faithfulness become even sweeter when they are no longer being checked. They simply continue. Perhaps that is why the garden feels as though it keeps watch without waking you. It is attentive without making you alert, protective without making you scan the horizon, present without asking to be acknowledged every moment. That is rare in the world. So many things demand to be noticed in order to keep existing in our minds. But the garden does not plead for attention. It lets you rest inside its care whether you are measuring it or not. A thin breeze arrives again from somewhere above the wall. It slips over the stone, touches the herbs, crosses the basin, and passes under the fig leaves with a low, sweet motion. Not cold, only clean. A breeze with no argument in it. It carries rosemary first, then the faint dryness of stone, then the clean smell of water, then almost nothing at all except night itself. If air could pray softly, it might feel like this. A movement so gentle it seems to bless whatever it touches without altering it. You are not outside the blessing of such small things. The air touches you too. The steadiness of the fountain reaches you too. The stored warmth of the stone bench and path belongs to you for this hour as much as to any branch or leaf or wall inside the garden. There is no need to earn entrance. You are already here. You have already crossed the arch. The garden has already received you. If sleep is not complete yet, there is no disappointment here. The garden does not evaluate the pace of your resting. It does not compare your quiet to another person's quiet. It does not ask why one thought remains. It simply keeps watch in the same tender way. Wall holding, water falling, leaf resting, air moving, lamp dimming, star appearing, night deepening. This constancy is part of its kindness. It does not become impatient with unfinished rest. A little stone channel near the base of the fountain gathers overflow and leads it away into darker soil. You can hear it now and then, if the whole garden grows still enough. A lower sound than the basin makes, a hidden water sound, a secret carrying away. Perhaps the mind needs that image, a small unseen channel taking what is extra, taking what does not need to remain pooled within you, taking the day's leftover brightness, leftover strain, leftover vigilance, and leading it somewhere farther from the place where you are trying to rest. Not dramatically, just steadily. Water knows how to carry things away without asking permission from the earth each time the fig leaves above you shift again. One large leaf touching another, and then stop. The birds do not wake. The branch does not complain. The dark receives the motion and returns to stillness. There is such ease in how living things inhabit this garden. No one seems embarrassed by needing rest. No one is resisting the hour. No one is trying to turn night into a second day. That wisdom is old and kind. The stars above the wall are clearer now, not brighter in a harsh sense, only steadier. Their calm makes the space above you feel deep but not empty. The walls keep the garden near. The stars keep the night wide. Between nearness and wideness, you may rest. That balance is a blessing to a tired soul. Too much closeness can feel trapped. Too much wideness can feel lonely. But here, there is enough of each, enough enclosure to feel safe, enough sky to feel gently held inside a larger peace. If the body wishes to drift farther now, let it do so without ceremony. Let the breath grow quieter than the fountain for a few moments. Let the limbs grow heavier than the bench or couch seems able to notice. Let the mind loosen its preference for sequence and simply receive sensation: warm stone, cool air, water, leaves, herbs, shadow, star, wall, rest. That is enough language now, perhaps more than enough. The garden keeps watch, not as a guard with tension, as a keeper with peace. The way a doorway may stand all night without strain, the way a tree may hold sleeping birds without waking them, the way a wall may remain firm without hardness, the way water may continue its song without tiring the ear. That is how the garden keeps watch over you now, not by asking you to remain alert, by allowing you to stop. And if some deep part of you still wonders whether it is safe to fall fully quiet, listen once more to the fountain. Look once more at the steel bowl by the wall. Feel once more the warmth left in the stone, beneath or near you. Hear the leaves not resisting the dark. Nothing here fears the night. You need not fear it either. For this hour, it is only a covering, only a shelter, only a patient dark through which rest comes softly. The night is deeper now, not later in a way that asks anything of you, only deeper, more settled. The garden has moved beyond evening and into that gentler middle place where even the memory of day has gone quiet. Warmth still remains in a few stones. Coolness has settled in the air. The stars hold their distant stations above the wall, and everything close by has accepted the dark completely. Dawn is not here. It does not need to be here. The garden is not waiting impatiently for morning. It is resting in the hour it has been given. That is the peace of this part of the night. Nothing leaning forward too quickly. Nothing trying to rush light back into the world. Only quiet. Only enough darkness to let the body sink beneath the surface of thought. Only enough calm to let sleep arrive without explanation. The fountain is gentler now than ever. Its sound seems farther away, though it has not moved. Perhaps that is what happens when rest comes nearer. The world does not disappear. It simply steps back one pace and speaks more softly. Water still falls. Stone still receives. The hidden channel still carries its little thread onward. But now these things are less like details and more like atmosphere. They surround you without asking to be followed. The leaves have nearly stopped entirely. When one does move, it sounds like a thought folding itself away. A very small sound. Then stillness. Then a stillness deeper than before. The birds are long asleep. The herbs breathe their fragrance only faintly now. The lamp at the doorway may still hold a tiny amber pulse, or perhaps it has gone out and left the wall to moon and star. Either way, nothing has been lost. The garden remains faithful in dimness. If you are lying beneath a tree, perhaps the woven cloth over you feels a little warmer now than it did when first imagined. Your own rest has given warmth back to it. That is a quiet comfort. Rest is not only receiving, it is also the body's gentle way of belonging to a place. You and the garden are no longer separate things arranged near one another. You are sharing the hour, sharing the dark, sharing the softness that has settled over stone and branch and breath alike. There is no need to think ahead. Morning can remain where it is, unarrived. You do not need to prepare for it yet. You do not need to rehearse it. The tasks of another day have no voice here. They stand outside the walls at a distance too far to matter tonight. If they return later, they may return later. For now, the garden keeps them small. For now, the night refuses to let them crowd the basin, the tree, the herbs, the bench, the bowl, the arch, the stars. For now, quiet is larger than all of them. Your breathing may be so soft now that it feels almost like listening instead of breathing. A little rise, a little fall. No need to improve it. No need to notice every cycle. The body has taken over its own kindness. It is doing what it has always known how to do when no one interrupts it with urgency. That is enough. The body was made for this kind of trust too, not only for carrying burdens and obeying alarms, also for releasing into safe darkness. If one final thought drifts near, let it pass across the top of the wall like a cloud passing above distant hills, not entering, not staying, only moving on. The inside of the garden remains unchanged. The fountain still falls. The stone still rests. The tree still holds its branch over you. One passing thought cannot undo such quiet. One memory cannot reclaim the whole hour. The night is larger than that now. Dawn is not yet. And because it is not yet, you are allowed to be nowhere but here. That may be the tenderest truth of all. No next thing. No next voice. No next duty. No next decision. Only the garden keeping its shape in darkness. Only the body sinking where it is safely received. Only the slow, deep quiet that comes when nothing more is required. Perhaps far away beyond the wall there is open land. Perhaps beyond that, roads. Perhaps beyond that, sleeping houses. Perhaps beyond that, hills holding the last of the night's cool air. You do not need to picture any of it clearly. It is enough to know the world is wide, and yet you are held in one small, peaceful place inside it. A garden does not need to be large to be complete. A resting place does not need to explain itself to be sufficient. The stars continue their calm shining, too distant to demand, near enough to reassure. The wall remains a shadowed line beneath them. The vine has gone still. The pomegranate tree keeps its fruit in darkness. The little bowl by the wall reflects almost nothing now. The fountain keeps its thread of sound. And you. If sleep has not fully come yet, may continue to float at the edge of it without any pressure to cross sooner. The edge is gentle too. The edge belongs to rest as much as sleep itself does. There is peace in unfinished drifting, peace in half-dreaming, peace in not knowing the exact moment when waking loosened its hold. The garden asks for no exactness. It is content with gradual things, with slow arrivals, with quiet changes that happen beneath notice. That is how night often heals, not by one great release, but by many small permissions given over time. A softer jaw, a quieter hand, a slower thought, a deeper exhale, a longer pause, a dimmer need to be on guard, until at last the whole person has entered rest without having to declare it. So remain as long as you like in this almost sleep, or let it deepen if it already has. The garden is not counting. The stars are not counting. The fountain is not counting. No one here is measuring how quickly you surrender to quiet. Everything in this place honors slowness. Everything honors the soft descent. Everything honors the tired creature learning once more that darkness can be gentle. Dawn is not yet. There is no need to go meet it. When it comes, it will come. When light returns, it will find the wall, the fountain, the tree, the herbs, the bench, the bowl, and perhaps even you, all exactly where quiet left them. Nothing is in danger because you rest. Nothing holy is diminished because you sleep. The world need not be held together by your wakefulness for one more hour. You may let it be kept by larger hands than yours. And if the heart needs one last reassurance before it slips away, let it be this. For now there is no demand in the night. Only quiet, only shelter, only the kindness of not yet. Not yet morning, not yet movement, not yet speech. Only this deep, still hour in which even the garden seems to breathe more slowly so that you may do the same. And the story we entered tonight rests softly now, not to trouble you, not to press on you any longer, only to stand at a distance, like an old wall in moonlight, quiet, steady, keeping watch without noise. May the night be kind to you. May your thoughts grow light. May your body sink fully into safe rest. May what felt heavy today loosen its grip. May what needed no answer tonight remain unanswered without fear. The garden is still here. The fountain is still speaking. The walls are still holding. And you do not need to hold on any longer. Sleep now, gently, deeply, peacefully, and let the quiet carry you the rest of the way.